network. So without further ado, and we'd like now to introduce Anil Soni. He's the global lead of construction and infrastructure sector at RICS, and he will be moderating today's panel session. Thank you, Anil.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'd like to welcome all of you to this session. Thank you very much for joining. I'm delighted to be part of the InfraChallenge 2021 program, both as a mentor and a moderator of this session today. In fact, thank you to Global Infrastructure Hub for inviting me. And both years, the last year as well as this year, I've participated, and I keenly wait for Jordana or Monica or Angelique's email to make me part of this program. So I'm really happy that I joined today. And we have an excellent expert panel that will discuss the first topic that we have for the event. So the way we are going to work is we have limited time. So I have requested each of our panel members to give an opening statement. In that part of that opening statement, they'll briefly introduce themselves also. So what I wanted to do was set the stage, put the context. By now, all of us agree that we need great infrastructure, quality infrastructure that is resilient, sustainable, and socially just. No longer can we only talk about time, cost, quality of infrastructure development and management. It is so crucial that our sector shifts the discussion to a systemic change that'll help deliver infrastructure that is required and needed by the society. We all know that data and tech will act as an enabler for the systemic change that our sector is going through. However, there is more that needs to be done. Obviously, there is some basic changes that are required, the way we operate, the way we develop and manage infrastructure. So we have three global experts with slightly different backgrounds and different expertise to answer this very basic question, which is, what are the systemic changes they see needed for the infrastructure sector to deliver what InfraChallenge 2021, this year's agenda, is all about? So with that sort of background, I would like to now request each one of my panel members to talk about this aspect from their worldview. So my role and goal today is to present these prompts to our experts and ask them to share their views. But before I do that, I'm going to ask them to give an opening statement and also introduce themselves, keeping the opening statement brief and connected to our central question. So I'm going to request Sarah, then Bernardine, and then Paul to make their opening statements, please.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, and thanks, Anil, for your participation here. I'd also like to thank the GI Hub for inviting me to participate in this panel, and to my co-panelists for your participation. My name is Sarah Alvarado. I am Executive Director at the Institute of Sustainable Finance in Canada. I joined here earlier this year. Prior to that, I spent 30 years in private sector basically in infrastructure, lending and investments in the private sector. And I spent also a stint at the European Investment Bank and the Canada Infrastructure Bank. As you all know, we recently published our Infrastructure 4.0 report, Achieving Better Outcomes with Technology and Systems Thinking, a World Economic Forum initiative supported by the GI Hub and a great community of experts from around the world, some of them included in this panel. I had the pleasure of co-chairing that initiative with Mark Anser. At the time, we discussed the need to leverage technology as an enabler for better and sustainable outcomes for society, including challenges but also opportunities in doing so, and not just for the sake of using technology, but looking at outcomes. We further discussed the fundamental changes introduced by climate change and global sustainability goals as it pertains to the development of infrastructure projects, which plays a key role in achieving sustainability and net zero goals. But this goes much prior to developing the infrastructure. It starts at the vision and the planning phases much before procurement, and therefore is very important that we think about the infra asset class as part of a much bigger system. This becomes even more critical as we see the lines between the different infrastructure asset classes, like transport and energy, for example, converging and crossing each other's territories as we move towards building cleaner and more sustainable infra of the future. Lastly, on my opening, as we all know, well-functioning economies would need financial capital, human capital, and productivity, i.e. technological developments. In infrastructure, much discussion is happening around the world on the financial needs, but much less on the productivity angle and the need for leverage infrastructure. So thank you to GI Hub for your leadership in inviting me to participate, and also participate as a mentor in this InfraChallenge competition. Is a great event to promote, encourage, and accelerate the development and commercialization of new technologies in the critical infrastructure sector. Thank you so much, and look forward to the discussion. Back to you, Anil.
Shall I start, Anil?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Anil. Hi, everyone. I'm Bernadine Ferns, or Ben Ferns. I'm the Global Head of Infrastructure at the Open Contracting Partnership, or OCP. OCP are a silo vesting organization. We work with government, civil society, businesses, academia, media to transform public procurement to deliver better goods, services, and public works for everyone. And in terms of my background, I'm a barrister by trade. Nobody is perfect, but there you go. And I spent the last 20 odd years or so of my career working on infrastructure, climate and environment, and the last 10 years or so, good governance issues, particularly economic, environmental, social justice, and transparency issues. So in response to your question, Anil, in terms of what are the systemic changes that we need on infrastructure, we're coming at this from a technological innovation perspective. We start with data. So the Open Contracting Partnership, our starting point for our interventions is very much related to open data and how more and better open data can help to transform public procurement to deliver better public works. We do this by fostering standardized, structured open data and enabling that to aid the planning, procurement, and delivery of infrastructure projects. We have delivered several open data standards, including the Open Contracting for Infrastructure Data Standard, or OC4IDS, and the Open Contracting Data Standard, OCDS, and we also have an extension for public-private partnerships, so OCDS for PPPs. Now, where we see the real value add for the work that we do on infrastructure is three things really. The first is joining up data and joining up planning, procurement, and delivery of infrastructure. The other is interoperability, and the third is openness that enables not just monitoring and accountability, but also enables businesses to better participate in these processes. And I'll go through these in turn. So the first point is really about joining up data to enable better data-driven decision-making. And the starting point for this is that very often, particularly for infrastructure, there's so many different actors operating at multiple levels for infrastructure. So even within governments itself, there are multiple different agencies, different departments, all doing different things. And people often think of government as a monolith, and obviously it's not. And so what we need here is a joined up process so that everyone can easily see and understand what is happening on infrastructure. So here's a simple example. We've all seen, for example, in our neighborhoods, how disruptive roadworks can be. So for example, you might have roads that are being dug up one day, repaved, and then dug up again and repaved and dug up again and repaved over and over again for all different things. And that might be to fix water pipes on day one, to install fiber on day 2, to do something else on day 3. And imagine if we could join up the process and use data to enable better coordination across different agencies so that you only dig once and then you can introduce all of these improvements that you want and then repay. So that's really important. And that's where open data and joined up open data comes in to be able to help that process. The second thing that's linked to that is that because there's so many different actors all doing different things, they also operate different systems and different platforms with all different formats for data, which makes it difficult for these agencies to talk to each other. So that's a key issue of interoperability. And this is why we need standardized, structured open data. And this is exactly the kind of thing that our data standards have been designed to address. So it enables interoperability. It helps different actors talk to each other. And in Buenos Aires, for example, we've seen that this type of interoperability can help save significant amounts of time. For the city government in Buenos Aires, when they adopted this type of joined up open data, they are seeing a 93% reduction in time for data collection and data sharing across agencies. So this is really important. And I can share those links in the chat shortly. And the final point that I want to make is that linked to this joined up open data is two aspects, one for accountability and the other for participation. So when you have this type of joined up open data, ideally when you have all of this information in somewhere that's easy to find and easy to use, it makes it easier for other stakeholders to monitor what's going on in infrastructure projects to see whether or not it's going well or not. We're seeing this effectively being used not just by citizens and civil society to monitor what governments are doing and how they're spending public money, but also by governments using that data for their own internal audits, for example, and to demand better results. Secondly, we've seen that this joined up data is also delivering benefits for the private sector, particularly improving competition and the ability for companies to participate. And very often you'll see, particularly for public infrastructure, again, you have multiple different systems with different notices for tenders and upcoming opportunities, which make it very difficult for companies to participate. So if you have something that's more unified, where companies can more easily find what opportunities are coming up, that makes it easier for them to plan and prepare as well. So those are my top 3 points for how we need to think about systemic change and the types of innovation that we need to be looking at. And later on, I can share some of our case studies as well of how we've been doing this. Back to you, Anil.
Thank you, Ben. Paul, over to you, a brief introduction and your opening remarks, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Paul. I'm based in Beijing. I work for Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is a multilateral development bank focusing on only infrastructure financing. I'm the strategy and policy officer specific to digital and technology. So to me, I think the opening remark is very simple. Why not, and why now? I think innovation and technology has been a buzzword, but it has also been made reality over the last couple of decades in all other sectors, except the sector that we're working on. And the simple answer to why this is incredibly important to us is post-COVID, we've seen changing consumer demands, and there is a new norm post-COVID. And many people joke about it, that the best CTO is COVID, and there is no reason why that is not true for the infrastructure sectors, unless we have many more anti-CTO than the other sectors. Why not? I think for many of us, we know construction industry and infrastructure, the most common word that we always hear is over budget, over time, not efficient, bad procurement. Why are we always hearing these words? Now, this would not happen in any other sectors. If any other sector hear that, the second year, either the company is gone or the contract is revoked or things will be disrupted. Now, so why not for us to think about how can we change this? Now, the last thing that I want to say is why now? Things have changed. Now, 20 years ago, probably we'll think the low-hanging fruits are in fintech, in e-commerce. That's true, because internet is made for information flow at its best use for consumers who are progressive and who are adaptive. But things are changing. Today, we're looking at technologies, innovations related to 5G, IoT, And as many of us will probably feel, there's no difference of 4G versus 5G if you're not watching ultra high definition Netflix. But it does make a huge difference to the industrialization, the more sophisticated built environment and system of systems. These are not the common technologies that we encounter day to day, but they are now happening. So there is a huge change. So I think there's a very good answer to why not, and why now, for innovation to develop a better, more resilient, and more sustainable infrastructure financing and construction environments.
Thank you, Paul. I think you framed it so well, and I really liked your quote about the CTO. So I think we already am seeing that a framework for our discussion is developing. One theme that I'm seeing is that the focus needs to be on outcomes. It really needs to be beyond traditionally what people like me who are construction guys, project management, always think about project management success. But you really need to think about project success so that the constructed asset that is delivered to the community really meets the goals of climate change, resilience, sustainability, and social justice. So clearly that's the top layer. And then we are seeing in our discussions enablers. There are business enablers, there are technology enablers, and then there are process enablers that we need. And we can utilize data and tech as the innovation lever to really make impact on those three buckets, which I call, again, your business enablers, process enablers, and technology enablers. At RICS, whenever we talk technology, we say data and tech, you would have noticed, because we feel that technology without data is just like a hammer looking for a nail. So our focus has always remained on this combined data and tech approach. We also have delivered a standard for cost management aspect of infrastructure projects, which now also will include carbon reporting. So we have a data standard called the ICMS, which is going to allow infrastructure sector to report at a high level in an internationally agreed taxonomy, life cycle costs, and upfront embodied carbon and operational carbon. So with having said that, I'm going to go back to Paul. And Paul, I know you're very passionate about this idea of keeping the goalpost focused on outcomes whenever we talk about infrastructure development and management. So would you like to shed a little bit more light on what you mean by shifting that focus?
Thank you very much. I know. I'll keep my answer very short, but I think thinking about outcome is the most important paradigm shift for not only infrastructure sector, but it's the core of innovation and the success of many other sectors as well. I would like to start with one example that is not entirely related to infrastructure. If we think about computer, and if we think about all these great innovation about internet, it all started with no user mindset. We all remember, like I'm probably younger, and I didn't get to send out the first email. It wasn't user friendly. So we have all been through that. But the problem is, how long can you sustain that non-user friendly, non-outcome driven, and non-design thinking way of doing things? And I couldn't think of another example that can self-perpetuate that way of doing things by simply building it for the sake of building it, and to engineer things for the sake of engineering things. There are probably no other sectors that can sustain that way of working as long as we do. So I think the outcome change really means three things. First, strategically, it really shifts our focus from what builds to what matters. Secondly, operationally, focusing on outcome will help us to really direct our energies as well as resources and management to things that really matter to the build-up of the infrastructure asset. Let me give a couple of examples. The first one, we have all seen how procurements work, and if we're not looking at outcome, increasingly we will miss the opportunity to use the best technology.
Paul, you're fading in and out, maybe the positioning of your microphone, perhaps.
So let me adjust it.
Much better now.
My apology. So the first thing that we think about the operational importance of the outcome-driven approach is that we can think for first time that what really matters to us instead of trying to cherry pick different types of technology. I'll just give a very simple example. Like in many of our financing as well as procurement process, we have to define a particular use of technology or particular solutions that we would like to procure. But if we've missed the outcome, then we miss the opportunity to find a better solution. Secondly, when we focus on the outcome, it also allows the financier to start thinking about what types of return profile that they can actually take and finance. If we're focusing on the assets, then all the focus is simply on the collateral value, on the contracts, on the cash flows, and anything but that. But if we start to focus on the outcome, and we will incentivize not only the operator, but as well as the financier to think about how can we finance the growth? How can we finance the outcomes? That we're not necessarily only looking at the asset, which is the road or the bridge, but we'll start to look at the economic outcomes of the mobility, the connections from point A to point B. And that is not only important for the operator, as well as the procurement parties, but it's also extremely important for the financiers. The last point that I want to make is it's really important for us to keep users at the front of our minds. And I think that's the core of all sorts of innovations that we have seen in other sectors. We talked about design thinking and so on and so forth. And I think the acronyms and almost the same representation of that in infrastructure is be outcome driven. Technology is just a means to an end, and it does not solve everything. Water pipes are still limited by the physical attributes of fluid of exit physics. So digital technology allows us to better sense and react to situations, but only if we have an outcome-driven mindset, then we'll be allowed and we'll be able to use technologies to deliver a better world that we want. And I think that has happened in all the other sectors that we have seen digital transformation making it magical impact. And I think for infrastructure, if we start to look at outcomes a little more, then we give more space for technology to create a benefit for a more resilient and sustainable future for us.
Thank you, Paul. Over to you, Sarah. In your opening remarks, including Ben's opening remarks, you guys talked about a whole of sector approach, essentially feeling that the business as usual is a bit fragmented, there are silos, and that causes a whole bunch of problems for us, and that's not sustainable. Would you like to elaborate on this issue of eliminating silos?
Yes, thank you, Anil, and thank you, Paul and Bernardine, for great comments. You know, my brain was flying as I heard you speak on one point on outcomes, absolutely, definitely. And Bernardine, you mentioned interoperability. And we look at those two. And as I mentioned earlier, the need for eliminating silos is critical, given the fundamental changes impacting infrastructure as a result of climate change and sustainability goals, and also technology itself. Let me give you an example so we can put this into perspective. Electricity needs, for example, were in great part modeled based on population growth, and the different parts of the value chain would move accordingly. So you look at generation, transmission, local distribution, the corresponding PPAs. I mean, all that is changing before our very nose extremely quickly, depending on the jurisdictions, of course, but it is a big fundamental change from how we used to do infrastructure even 5 or 7 years ago, with an enormous demand for electricity coming from the electrification of transport, for example, this including rail, trucks, cars, even bicycles these days. The demand formula gets a little bit more complicated, as you can imagine. So not only on the actual volume demand for electricity, but the timing of it too, and the intermittency of it. With more sources of energy coming from renewable power and the intermittent nature of those systems, such as solar, wind, and hydro, one can't but to think about the need for all stakeholders to work closer than ever in solving the models of the future, technology being a great enabler. So as Paul and Bernardine mentioned, it's not just per se just to use technology and to just to technify everything, but looking at the outcomes, looking at how the systems interoperate. That's why I picked the example of energy and transport, because and the need to eliminate silos, and that would be silos at the government level, when you go to the financiers and you go to the bank levels, sector levels, rating agencies. They used to look at transport as one animal, energy as another animal. Now all those systems need to communicate. So outcomes and interoperability, to point back to Paul's and Bernardine's comments, open data, the issue of data is extremely key, but the need to talk between sectors, we're not isolated sectors, broadband is part of the whole thing, will be key to get this exercise going. Think about balancing the grid, for example. Hydrogen is another example, energy storage. I mean, we can go on. So quite timely to be having this chat at the infra competition events, given the importance of clean tech and infra tech developments. Thank you. Back to you, Anil.
Thanks, Sarah. Bernardine, you know that I love data standards. So you knew this question is coming. Do you think data can break down the silos? And why data standards? Why do we need data standards?
Thanks, Anil. I've been so encouraged by this conversation. So I think that all four of us here make a super team for project that we could work on and do something really magnificent. So just want to say +1 to everything that you, Anil, Paul, and Sarah have said, and I think we're all aligned on that. I was particularly excited, Anil, that you were saying that ICMS is now including carbon reporting. So I think that's really fascinating. We'd love to, we can pick that up offline. So like you, I think data and standardized structured open data or data standards really help this work. For all of the points that we've been talking around on this conversation, so interoperability, as Sarah and I have been talking about, outcomes-based, as Paul and Sarah and I have also been talking about. So I'm not going to repeat that because I think we're really aligned on that, but I can give you some practical examples of how our data standards or open data standards more broadly is helping to deliver these types of outcome-based infrastructure, and also how, going to Paul's point, that it speaks to the return profiles as well, that helps that to be more meaningful. And of course, that also links to being user-led. So the first example that I want to share is an example that we're working on with our partners in India. So we're working with a team called Civic Data Lab. They're doing a lot of really great work, first in Himachal Pradesh and now in Assam State. So in Assam State, they're working particularly in floods, where many people may know that they suffer from severe floods every year, which causes huge devastation to the local populations. And one of the key things that we're working on there is to help to join up the planning and procurement data with environmental data, so things like flood propensity and flood intensity, but also with vulnerability data, so looking at poverty, loss of lives or injury, and socioeconomic data like livelihoods and property damage, so that we can join up that data and overlay it to help the decision makers pinpoint the areas of greatest need, and not just for the sake of building flood defense infrastructure, for example, but making sure that people are best served by the flood mitigation infrastructure that's being built. So looking at those areas that are in greatest need, where people are suffering the most. So not looking at infrastructure in isolation. And that's something that's really interesting because, as I talked earlier about the silos, and as Sarah mentioned as well about the silos in the way that infrastructure is planned and delivered, a lot of times, there are different objectives by different actors, who all have a different way of doing things. So joining up data in this way and creating this tool that helps all the relevant actors see at a glance what is needed is really helpful. And similarly, we worked on something similar in Malaysia, looking at schools and hospitals. So again, looking at joining up procurement data for schools and hospitals, and looking at capacity needs. So looking at capacity gaps, so things like the ratio of beds to patients, the number of desks to students, teachers to students, and things like that, and then cross-referencing that with low-income groups. So again, the decision makers can better plan and identify those areas of greatest need. So where do you need the most schools and hospitals, so that you're not building schools and hospitals in areas that are oversaturated, you're building it in other areas to, for example, reduce the distance that have to be traveled by the poorest people to get access to this type of healthcare or education. A third example I want to share is an example in Honduras, where we've been working with our partners there at COST, the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative, to again join up infrastructure planning and procurement data with environmental data, like forest cover, like the occurrence of landslides, again, to try and improve the resilience of infrastructure that's being built so that it can withstand, for example, landslides, and also to safeguard forests to prevent deforestation from large infrastructure projects. So again, open data and data standards can help to build these tools to streamline the process, because as I mentioned before, if everyone is working with different data sets that's not joined up, that's in different formats, it becomes very difficult to understand what's going on. And that's how those data standards help to deliver these types of tools and innovations that can help make decision-making easier, that can help us achieve those outcomes that we want, so that infrastructure is user-led. And then finally, one final thing I want to say is that we're also working with our team in India to map infrastructure procurement data to the Sustainable Development Goals, so that you can actually follow the money and see how public money that's being spent and to what extent it's actually delivering those goals that we want from the SDGs. So I'm going to pause there, Anil, and hand it back over to you.
Thank you so much. We have several questions that we have received. We promise to answer those, so I'll circulate amongst us. We'll come up with responses and share it with you through the GI Hub team. I'd like to thank GI Hub for organizing this session. Thanks to all the panel members for sharing your time and your expertise. Best of luck to the top 20. You all are winners, because you are causing this discussion to take place, a very important discussion on how we bring systemic change to the infrastructure sector. So with that, we're going to close this session. I'm going to pass it over to Monica, who's going to do the next session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Anil, for chairing that insightful discussion on some of the key areas for change that can enable the scalable adoption of technology. Our next session is going to look a little bit more in depth around a specific innovative approach to technology partnerships, which has been able to enable that adoption of technologies in emerging economies. And with me, I have Reynaldo Fioravanti, who's the lead sector specialist for infrastructure at the Inter-American Development Bank. So Reynaldo is based in Washington, D.C., and has led the financing of large infrastructure projects and was head for Central America and the Caribbean in the transport division. He currently focuses on the structuring of public-private partnership transactions and advises on the infratech strategy for the IDB's infrastructure department. So welcome, Reynaldo, to our conversation today. I'm actually looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Monica. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, I guess in light of the conversation that we just had about systemic change and, obviously an outcomes-focused approach to, enabling that adoption of technology and that successful adoption of technology, the IDB has actually implemented, very fit-for-purpose model for accelerating that kind of adoption of technology among your member countries. But before we get into the details of that, can you tell us why technology is important for you from an infrastructure perspective, and how the need for technology is different between emerging economies versus advanced economies?
Sure, thank you very much. Well, thank you for the invitation. Congratulations for the initiative. I've been following the InfraChallenge from previous year, and it's really welcome initiative. Well, at IDB, the digital technologies are at the core of our strategy. In our 2025 vision, we see that technology is going to be essential for the recovery of the economies, but also to enable the growth that emerging markets badly need. And of course, as a bank, as a development bank, we work not only in the infrastructure sector, we work in other sectors like health, education, and financial markets. And we see digital technologies making big changes in these sectors. Specifically in infrastructure space, just like Paul mentioned, we are lagging behind. So that's one of the things that been motivating us to improve and work in different areas. And we see that the benefit of digital strategy or infratech in many aspects, like not only productivity and efficiency, but also resilience and inclusion, what we've been discussing here, right? And these are very, very, very important for emerging markets. Just to give an examples, in productivity, when you talk about a new infrastructure and technologies like Beam or one of the applications that we developed, the infratech, target specific problems, just like the panel mentioned, costs overrun, delays in construction, things that we've been struggling for years, and we are seeing in the field big changes with technology. In terms of efficiency, the management of existing assets, for example, smart meters in the energy sectors are not only improving efficiency, but also enabling distributed generation, for example. In terms of resiliency, another example that I like is during the pandemic, we've been working with public transportation agencies to improve the recovery or the recovery of the transportation services. So that was technology in that case was fundamental. And inclusion, because we need most important in emerging markets, giving access to the poor and the most vulnerable population. So that's another area where for us as a development bank, we put a lot of focus in terms of how technology can enable the change. And taking the approach that we've been discussing here, focus on outcomes and not on products, right? So that's we are also very aligned with that vision. Specifically talking about emerging markets, of course, there are areas, Monica, where I see that technology is really badly needed. And like I mentioned, we see this as we go to the field and we work with the client countries in implementing it. For example, a clear difference that we see when we look at developed world is maintenance of infrastructure, right? So in emerging markets, infrastructure agencies are usually struggling to maintain the existing infrastructure. Sometimes the challenge is not even to build new infrastructure or expand the stock of infrastructure. It's prevent that the stock declines. And most agencies operate in a very limited budget, and they usually don't have the budget available for maintenance. So any software or application or technology that can improve efficiency in that area, I can mention some examples later, are making a huge difference. I mentioned the issue of building new infrastructure. So in emerging markets, we were supposed, at least in the Latin America and the Caribbean region where I work, we are supposed to invest 5% of GDP on average, just to solve the gap that we have. And we usually invest 1.5 on average. So we do have a gap that we need to tackle somehow. Of course, financing is going to be one of the solutions. We've been working a lot with private sector, but really technology has a role to play here. Inclusion is another aspect where emerging markets have much more relevant needs and immediate needs. For example, users that don't have internet access, or users that cannot, users with special needs that just cannot use public transportation, for example. So we see also technology making changes in that aspect. Of course, not everything is opportunity. Working in emerging markets, we do have challenges to implement technology. One that I mentioned already is some countries don't have a broadband connection, or even a big portion of the population don't have internet access. So many times our effort is focused on solving this foundational infrastructure that will enable you to implement more sophisticated solutions. The issue of affordability, and that comes to your introduction in terms of what is the model that IDB is implementing to accelerate infratech. Affordability of solutions, of tech solutions, is an issue for our clients. And that led us, for example, to implement in-house solutions that could be made available without cost without charge for our members. So affordability is another challenge. And lastly, but not least important, education and training. As we work with developers, as we work with startups, there is a gap, there's a lack of people trained to develop solutions, right? So this is a very foundational problem that emerging markets are facing in the infra space and in the infratech space. So for us at IDB, we see that our role is very important. So we want to accelerate this, of course, working with policy regulations, investments, but also bringing startups to the space. So this is why I welcome the initiative of InfraChallenge and congratulate you guys.
That's great. Thank you, Reinaldo. And, definitely touching on that point of, providing more cost-effective infrastructure solutions is key. And, especially when it comes to affordability. In fact, affordability of infrastructure was one of the key long-term outcomes that we have seen as well through some of our work, in terms of governments in emerging markets, in terms of their infrastructure priorities, post-COVID as well, to help with the recovery. So I think that's great. So you talked about affordability, education, and training, potentially closing the financing gap with some of the outcomes that you're looking for. So tell us a little bit more about this unique model that has been highly effective in some of your chosen markets, and tell us a little bit more about your journey in being able to develop and implement this model, including some of the key challenges that you have encountered throughout.
Sure. Thank you. Well, at the IDB, we've been approaching the strategy of digital technologies in different perspectives. So in some cases, especially in other sectors, we use the top-down approach, meaning, okay, so as a development bank, we go and we support countries with finance, with regulations, with institutional changes that will enable them to accelerate the implementation of digital solutions. That has been working in some sectors, but especially in infrastructure, we saw many challenges. So we shifted a little bit the approach more to what I call a bottom-up approach. So instead of when you work at the policy or regulatory level, but you don't have, for example, basic things like enough companies willing to develop solutions in infrastructure, or you don't have priority or a budget in the agencies. So the top-down approach does not work. So what we did is we started developing solutions internally, in some cases completely in-house, to provide the solutions for the countries. So of course we work with in-house solutions with support with some external developers, but we engage directly with the infrastructure agencies, with city managers. We deployed pilots and prototypes that allow the bank to create awareness for infratech, test the concepts in many cases, and most important, I think, is to make a technology and policy on a single issue, right? So approximate the technology solution with implementations of policies that will generate impact. So that has been working for us right now. Of course, as a development bank, we looking forward. We see this as an acceleration process. We probably won't continue developing in-house solutions as we develop new partners, as we develop certified developers that can deploy the solutions and hopefully come up with new solutions. This is the way forward in our perspective. I'll give you an example of a solution that we followed exactly this approach. We call it Espaciado. It's basically a software application that using computer vision measure real time the average distance between passengers and public transportation in public transport during the pandemic. So that some cities helped the city managers to make decisions on what the capacity they would deploy, what restriction they would implement. And now, as we move forward, and we are hopefully leaving the pandemic, they are using the same technology for safety purpose, for example. So, and we see that this kind of solution has been internalized by the partners. So, and it was in many aspects, Monica, foundation for a bigger policy institutional change. So that's how we see a model that we believe it is going to work for us in the future. Like I mentioned, as we move forward, of course, as a development bank, we need to leverage our financial instruments so we can help countries to implement the solutions. But we are convinced that this is one way to go, and this is pretty much what we're doing right now.
And if I may ask a follow-up question to what you mentioned there. So you're developing technologies in-house, which is quite an interesting model, I think, for anyone to take on. How are you commercializing some of these technologies, and how are you supporting its implementation? And how does that fit in, within the capacity of the development bank?
We are making usually the licenses free. We use the concept of Creative Commons. Basically, you make the license public, and so the government can use it and recognize the rights of the IDB. In some cases, we can support in the development and implementation or improvements. Depends on the capacity you have with the counterpart, with the client. And at this stage, then we deploy other financial instruments that we have. So it could be a technical assistance, either reimbursable or non-reimbursable. Could be a loan, a component of a major investment zone. So that's the way we are deploying this. And another aspect which is very important, not only for these solutions, but to develop the market as a whole, is to certify vendors and startups and developers that can deploy these solutions. So this is exactly what we are doing right now.
And to become a technology developer, as well as being able to provide that kind of license for free through a Creative Commons license, what kind of change or innovation was needed with respect to policy and regulation, both from within the IDB and also from your client side to enable this way of working?
Sure. Well, I think external in the clients, we see many changes in terms of, well, in some cases, very high level regulations. For example, in Brazil just released a very important regulation on antennas that will enable 5G and IoT, for example. So we've been talking about developing IoT solutions in the port sector, for example, and so the regulations of antennas was something that was needed. Another dimension, looking at the external, the clients, is as you guys must be facing as well, is the procurement process, right? So procurement at the governments, procurement at the development banks are not designed for technology. In some cases, you can adjust. In some cases, you need to issue completely new regulations. Brazil, another example in Brazil is they approved a legislation on startups that allows the government to hire startups in some cases, because they never win a bidding once they don't have experience, and usually the traditional procurement process value experience. So those changes we see very, very frequently on our clients, but also internally at the bank. And I can mention some, for example, even the staff, the profile of the staff. So right now we have a data scientist work for the bank. We have developers, we have project managers focused on digital solutions, something that in infrastructure department, like 2 or 3 years ago, we are not planning to have. So that implies major changes, as you can imagine, in a big organization or in a public organization, right? Including for how you're gonna reward these people and give them a career path, for example. So, and also instruments. I mentioned that as a development bank, we need to streamline this, and we need to mainstream this and leverage our financial capabilities so we can make big impact. So the instruments that we use to apply in the infrastructure sector, which is basically investments loans focused on the construction of a specific asset, also had to be not, I wouldn't say change it, but expanded in some aspects. Some instruments that we didn't use in the past, we are using, for example, policy loans, which is basically loans that disburse against a set of conditions that a country complied. That was used in the past for fiscal or social sector, for example, but not much in infrastructure. So as we go and we need to make big changes, we are working more on those different instruments. So this is sorry. No, and just a final comment on this. And also, technology implies risk in many cases. And our development banks are not, they're really risk averse in most cases, right? So you need to convince people, and you need to create mechanisms to allow you to test solutions and to make mistakes. So this is another big change that we are facing.
And in terms of testing some of those mechanisms to enable the bank to become less risk averse, can you share with us a recent project where you had significant success, but also some significant learnings? And what can the audience take away from your experience?
Sure. Yeah, we have sorry. We have many examples. And I can mention 2 or 3 for the sake of the time. One that I can start with the bad one. A couple of years ago, we are in a major project. We are financing in the border of Argentina and Chile. We try to implement a defensive border crossing system in a tunnel that we are connecting both countries. We're financing the expansion of the tunnel. And we thought it would be a good idea to implement a smart road tunnel project, right? So with a system that would control the traffic flowing through the road, leading to the border crossing, to the cameras, optic fiber system, and alerts and warning for extreme weather. It was mountainous regions with snow part of the year. So technology was ready. We are leading the financing, the construction. So we thought it was a good idea, but it was not. And looking back, we never managed to implement the solution because we had so many issues and priorities that technology was just not the first priority. So we had 2 countries, dozens of agencies, including immigration, road management, customs, right? Someone mentioned here the issue of silos. That was the case. So many silos and so many agencies trying to put together a large project. And we had a $5 million component in the technology in a $700 million project. So there was not, we didn't have the priority. We had so many issues to solve, and it didn't work at all. So in this case, it was not the technology, it was the whole system that was not in place. On the other side, one example that we are very proud of, and we've been discussing before, Monica, is what we call pavimentados. Sorry, it's in Spanish, the name. It's basically an application to assess road quality and signage and plan interventions. That goes to the issue that I mentioned before, the issue of maintenance, right? The road maintenance is a burden for many agencies. So with this app, using computer visions and AI, the software allows the reduction of the cost to make the inventory of the road by 80%. And also we are deploying now road safety components in this software. So instead, in addition to the quality of the road, also we're going to assess the road safety and recommend interventions. Just like we mentioned before, the solution was developed mostly in-house. We implemented in 20 cities. Right now we are working with the EBRD. They are interested in implementing in Europe. And the key factor, to go to your main question here, the key factor for success here was to build a solution based on real demand, right? And the real pain points that the agencies are having, right? So we have an aggregated requirement from agencies that maintenance was an issue. So it seems too obvious, right? But it's not sometimes. In the other factor that I mentioned before is success factor was to create a solution that was affordable and scalable, and that's what we are learning in the process. I can give you quickly another example, Aquarate, which is a system, data. We've been talking here about data standard and open data. Aquarate is a platform for assess the performance of public utility companies in the water sector. We've been very successful, and it's enabling major changes in the sector. The application allows you to implement, to assess and recommend actions for the company. So that's also leading to other projects that we are financing. And I would say,
I think,
takeaway. Sorry.
So we might have to wrap it up there. I mean, we can quite easily carry on with this conversation. And in fact, we probably will in November when we talk a little bit more about financing infratech. But I mean, very interesting points, obviously, especially around, maintenance and the aggregation of needs, across a number of different countries as well. Some great examples, but we will now have to hand over to Henry Blas, the Chief Contents Officer for the GI Hub, who you heard from earlier on this evening or this morning, depending on where you are in the world. And he will be presenting the next session. Thank you so much, Reynaldo, and we'll talk again soon, no doubt.
Thank you, Monica.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you, Reynaldo, again for those great insights and great examples. I'm sure we could have continued and hear more. So I'm delighted to be moderating today's case studies insight session. There will be around 25 minutes, and we'll be discussing case studies of implemented real-life tech solutions that display resilience and sustainability. So I'd like to welcome two guest speakers and invite them to briefly introduce themselves as well. The first one is Piero Pilizzaro, is a Chief Resilience Officer of the City of Milan. Piero? Yep, and then Melissa Zanocco, she's the Head of Programs Infrastructure Client Group. So actually, I mean, given the time, I think we'll just jump into the question, and then feel free to introduce a bit more what you do and the entity you're acting with. So Piero, if I start with you, so the last year obviously has been challenging and has shifted priorities globally. I mean, it's the least we can say. So can you tell us a little bit more about what impact COVID and what the pandemic in general had on prioritizing making cities more resilient?
Good morning, good afternoon, and thanks for inviting me over. I mean, the last year and a half already, because it's already 1 year and a half, has a high impact in terms of improving the capacity of the city to make resilience for more different perspective. What we have learned that we have to include in our modeling the unpredictable. That is something that it's really was challenging, and also what we suppose not to be the worst case scenario could become possible. This should be a lessons learned for what was the management of the city, but as well for infrastructures. We already have seen in Italy the collapse of the Morandi Bridge in Genoa, for example. That was not properly thought that it was possible, and I think that this element that we need to deal with the complexity and unpredictable is one of the most important lessons learned we got from the last year and a half. On the other end, we also have to increase the capacity of the city administration and all the stakeholders together to have high speed in terms of responsive. That it's with multiple impact that a single event could have on our everyday life and the functioning of our community. So I think that the timing and unpredictable are the two keywords of what we should learn from the future in terms of managing, designing, and envisioning the future of our city, our infrastructure.
Great, thanks, Piero. So if I turn to Melissa now. So I think in April this year, I saw that the UK Built Environment sector published a vision. It was called the document is called A Vision for the Built Environment. So can you tell us a little bit more, why is the vision important and how does technology enable it?
Yes, thank you. And let me also start by saying thank you for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be here. So I've actually got some slides just to, because there's some great visuals in here, which I think will illustrate a lot of things that actually have been said going before. So you can see in this diagram that technology is only one part of the triangle that makes up the components of digital transformation. So at its simplest, digital transformation is about enabling people to use information to make better decisions, to improve processes, and to apply technology wisely. And this needs to be applied to all organisations, and I mean across the whole supplier ecosystem, to all delivery processes, and across all built environment systems. So if you can just go on to my next slide, please. But however, the digital transformation, and we've heard quite a lot today, so I just thought it'd be good to have a visual up there, is that digital transformation is not the end that we're aiming for. So it's only there to enable our outcomes. So digital transformation is about the right people having the right information at the right time to make decisions that enable better outcomes. So as you can see here, you've got the raw data that sits at the bottom, that gets turned into the information, that can then be used by people to make better decisions, and those decisions lead to action, and all of that leads to better outcomes. So if I can have the next slide, because what I would like to do is sort of delve down a bit deeper into this. We've been talking a lot about outcomes. So everyone, I've been really impressed, actually really pleased. Everyone's been talking about outcomes. So, but if technology-based solutions are there to achieve better outcomes, then what do we mean by better outcomes? And that's where the vision comes in. So as you said, in April, the built environment in the UK got together as a sector to publish our vision for the built environment. So there was over 40 cross-industry bodies and 75 industry leaders who contributed to shaping the vision. And I'm actually going to read it out. It's our vision is for a built environment whose explicit purpose is to enable people and nature to flourish together for generations. And it's only when we shift our focus from creating the built environment to the outcomes that are enabled by it that people and nature can thrive together. And you can see that the built and natural environments are complex and interconnected systems that are essential for our well-being. And so improving outcomes for people and nature depends on those services that these systems provide and on coordinating the built environment as a whole, not just as individual parts. And we believe that we can make our vision a reality, but only if we all play our part with energy and coordination, important, and purpose, making use of the advanced arrays of enablers that we have at our disposal. And these include the technology-based solutions that we're going to see tomorrow in the final. So we can just go on to the next slide. So it's crucial that the outcomes are aligned from top to bottom. So from the global, so the UN Sustainable Development Goals, through national strategic priorities like net zero, through local requirements, and to investment decisions for individual interventions. So the application of the technology-based solutions is there to enable the achievement of outcomes at one or all of the levels that are shown on this diagram. If I can have the next slide, please. So literally on Monday, just a few days ago, the UK Infrastructure and Projects Authority published Transforming Infrastructure Performance, Roadmap to 2030, which translates that vision into system-based outcome-focused policy. And it includes this built environment model, which recognises the need for system-level solutions and for optimising the 99.5% of what we've already built. I think other people have said this today, it's already built, we're only adding 0.5 each year. But most importantly, the role of data in informing better decisions. And it also includes a practical 10-year action plan that's going to help us to make the vision a reality. I'll hand back.
Thank you, Melissa. That was great. And so that was just published. So we'll come back to you later. So if I can go back now to Piero. First, maybe I'd like you to elaborate a little bit about what's your role as the Chief Financial Officer within Milan, and then if you could give us some examples of resilient solutions that are currently implemented in Milan or in other cities as part of the network of resilient cities.
So, as a Chief Resilience Officer in a city administration, we are located within the Environmental Transition Department, but for the City of Milan, the Environmental Transition Department doesn't mean only environment, dealing with environment. It's dealing with rethinking the way of planning the city. So our general director is also in charge of coordination of the other planning and infrastructure department of the city, because what we need to do is to mainstream the concept of resilience and adaptation to climate change to on everyday activities for our life. So from like an infrastructure, a bridge, to an urban planning design, and to like the social services in general. So we are focusing on looking at the impact of climate change on infrastructures, on population, on health of our community. So working more on the adaptation. And when we think about adaptation to climate change, it comes also the resilience of the infrastructures. One of these is what we're now working on, how to reduce the, let's say, the blackout, for example, during the summertime when there is a heat wave and a detailing effect, so how we can improve the resilience of our energy grid. There is two ways of approaching this issue. There's multiple, but let's focus on two ways of approaching the energy grid. The one is looking at the big grid, the high voltage grid, and try to improve the maintenance. On the other end, it's trying to improve and the creation of microgrid in the city. How we are now moving to create a microgrid? We are now start designing and implementing the first energy community that is based on EU legislation in promoting decentralized energy production and makes the people in the community also more capable to self-consume what they produce in terms of energy. But this microgrid is also helping us to reduce and isolate part of the grid when there is a heat wave, so to better managing let's say the demand of energy, the electricity in particular. This energy community has also another impact on resilience, is a way how to redistribute incomes, because we reduce the cost of energy on family with the self-consumption. So we also improve the capacity to get access to capital to the low-income population, because we start from the peripheries, from the peri-urban area of the city. Then it's one of the inputs. On the other, we're also looking. We are now working on the sewage system, for example, how we improve the capacity of our grid on infrastructures. And one of the projects, the pilot project we have, is to recover the heat of the sewage system and pumping into the public residential buildings. So it's how we use urban metabolism of the infrastructures and the water and energy nexus to improve the, let's say, reduce the CO2 reduction emission and improve the capacity of using renewable energy within the community. And this is something that is really important in a city as Milan, that luckily we are not suffering from droughts of water scarcity, but the opposite. We have too much water in the cities. And then comes from different reasons. One of the reasons was not that our, let's say, industrial production was not so resilient in the 2008, because a lot of industry closed up because of a financial crisis. But then this industry was water intensive industry, so they were pumping water from the underground and using from the industrial production. This has created an increase of the underground water level, and then plus the increase of the intensity of the extreme weather event, then create a critical situation. So improving the nexus between energy and water and recovering the heat, but also recovering the water, is also a way how we should adapt to the impact of climate change in terms of storm. Then it's another one. All these couple of let's say on the energy community, as this one, within the Resilient Cities Network, we have a coordination, a working group between cities that it's important that it's important, like, for us to share the collaboration with cities and the practice. Our third one is to reduce the impact of flash flooding, for example. So we are launching, based on the experience of Rotterdam, of Paris, and other cities, what do the so-called pavement. So how we remove concrete and asphalt, and we create more green infrastructures and more green space in the city. But it doesn't mean only when we should create a new grass or a new flower. It's also when we look at an infrastructure as a parking lot, how we can put the capacity of drainage the water in this sense. So that is working on materials. And a lot of these materials, we are now looking at the capacity of using recycling materials. So the circularity of the materials as also a way to reduce another impact that we have seen over the last 1 year and a half after the pandemic. The increased cost of the raw materials for construction, that's always creating because of the demands, because it's increasing the demand for the new investment in all different countries, but as well for the restriction that was created in the trade due to different like diplomatic relations at the global scale. And if we are capable to keep using the raw materials that is present in the cities through a circularity and recovery, we're also reducing the impact of another global risk that then impact on a city as Milan, that is when it's produced the 90% of the GDP of the Italian economy. So that is an essential part of the country. All these three different experiences are something related to infrastructure that is essential and somehow, but now we are facing another challenge in infrastructures. How we should move from is the mobility infrastructures, because we need to move from a car-driven society to a more sustainable mobility society, when bike lanes, pedestrian, and public transport should be at the head of our design in the city. This is not because we are against the automotive or cars, but it's a necessity for cities. for the pollution, because we are located in one of the most polluted areas in Europe, in the Pianura Padana. But on the other hand, cars is also one of the heating sources in the city. If you measure the temperature of parking cars during the summertime, could reach 80 degrees. That is something that we need to avoid to improve. And also reducing the number of cars on the street and maybe working more on the vertical parking slot, for example. It is also creating a new space for people and for green infrastructures to improve the canopy, reduce the heat, and taking back the public space to the population. That was something that was pretty clear that there's a necessity after the pandemic to increase the space for physical distance in the community and to keep the safety of all of us. So that is some of the experience we are doing in Milan, but based on the collaboration that we have among the fantastic network of the Resilient Cities Network that was always supportive before the pandemic and during the pandemic, and even now to find a proper solution for future of our city.
Thank you, Piero. And it's fascinating hearing you talking about those examples and thinking back as to what Melissa was saying about the importance of thinking about systems, because as you sort of exactly pointed out, all the systems are related, and actually the solutions that you've described, they all sort of they all sort of touch on energy, water, transport, etc. So if I can go back to Melissa, I'd like to hear a little bit more around the Infrastructure Client Group's Project 13. Obviously, they're a very important project for all of us that are touching procurement and infrastructure in general. Can you give us some case studies on how the model has enabled the adopters, people using it, to use innovation solutions focused on resilience and sustainability?
Yes, thank you. And again, I've got some slides because they speak 1,000 words. So what you can see on here, on the right-hand side, is the Project 13 enterprise delivery model. And basically, the enterprise brings together the owners, the partners, the advisors, and the suppliers, working in more integrated and collaborative arrangements underpinned by long-term relationships. And the participating organisations are incentivised to deliver better outcomes. So it's important to note that Project 13 is made up of best practice from across the industry in actual projects that already exist. And they've just been brought together in one model. And then on the left, you can see, and again, people have spoken about it already earlier, that you can see the traditional transactional model for delivering major infrastructure projects and programs. And it creates those parent-child, hierarchical, siloed relationships that prevents the efficient delivery and prohibits the use of innovation, like the ones that we're going to see tomorrow. Whereas the Project 13 model, it allows for maximum exploitation and flexibility in order to get the benefits from innovation and digital. So if I can have the next slide, please. So Project 13 is defined by 5 pillars, which you can see on the left, and then a set of principles. And there's also a maturity matrix, and that's acknowledging that this is a journey to a high-performing enterprise. You don't start off jumping straight to that. And it stays at the principles level, so it remains widely applicable across a range of projects and programs. And organisations can interpret the principles in a way that works best for them, but what they can't do is to cherry pick. And they can't just pick the ones that are easiest without tackling the fundamental issues. For example, again, lots of people talked about it, procuring on lowest cost. So if you go to the next slide, these are the people that are doing it, the actual practical examples. So we've got a growing community of adopters who are putting those principles into practice, and they meet together to share their challenges and learning, and thereby accelerating their transformation and the benefits realised from them. And I was just going to pick on Anglian Water's Strategic Pipeline Alliance. And they're going to be making use of the latest technology, some that's never been used before in the UK, to reduce the carbon footprint and any environmental impact from the programme. So I was going to just give you 3 examples. Number 1 is their digital twin technology. So the whole scheme is supported by cutting-edge digital infrastructure, basically a digital twin, which will mirror the physical infrastructure in a virtual world. And this will provide the company with real-time data, helping to monitor the network and driving the insights that will improve the service for the customers. The number 2 is a virtually waterless pipe testing. So the engineers will be using equipment and a process that's never been used in the UK before. It allows pipes to be laid to a food grade standard of hygiene and disinfected using a vastly reduced amount of water than in traditional mains laying. And just to say that one of the reasons for this is that there is a shortage of water. So as opposed to Milan, as you were saying, they have really big problems with water in that area, in parts of their area. And the pipe plough, that's the third one, and that's specialist equipment that can be used on sections of the scheme. And it uses a blade to cut through the earth, creating a precise trench, and then it immediately lays the pipe within it. So there's no need for digging or refilling. And it's worth saying that Anglian Water itself as a whole has already reduced their embodied carbon of its infrastructure projects by 61% since 2010. So they were really ahead of the curve, as you can see from 2010. And then I'm just going to end, I've just got another couple of slides, if I can take the next one. I just wanted to end with a really exciting example of an initiative that's just kicking off that perfectly demonstrates an innovative infrastructure solution for a more resilient future. So the Climate Resilience Demonstrator, or CREDO as it's known, and it involves 3 of the members of the infrastructure client group, and it's being run by the Centre for Digital Built Britain. And so if we take this systemic approach, then we need secure, resilient data sharing across organisations and sectors. So the Centre for Digital Built Britain coordinates the National Digital Twin Programme and the approach to the development of an information management framework. And that information management framework will establish a common language by which digital twins of the built and natural environment can communicate securely and effectively. Or in other words, it's going to create the rules of the game within which the market can then compete and drive innovation. And the National Digital Twin envisages a federation of digital twins that are able to connect with each other through the information management framework when required for a specific purpose to support that improved decision making. And CREDO will demonstrate a thin slice of the envisaged ecosystem of connected digital twins, and it may be the first step on the information management framework to trial cross-sector interoperability. So after they've done this trial, they might just be able to keep building on it to create the information management framework. So just finish on my final slide. The scenario for the initial use case will be the impact of flooding on the networks. And they're creating an impactful film that's telling the story of why data sharing and connected digital twins are needed to improve climate resilience and to adapt to climate change, as well as a public visualization tool where people will be able to experiment with the different interventions and different scenarios as if they were actually using a digital twin to mitigate the effects of a flood on infrastructure services. And they should both be ready for COP26. Come back.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you so much, Vanessa. Thank you so much for that. I think we had one last question, but unfortunately we won't have time. Unless you wanted to share 1 or 2 words, literally 1 or 2 words on what you think the startups are listening to us today. All those innovators, what is it that you think they should focus on after COVID? And again, you only have 1 or 2 words because we're running out of time. Who wants to go first?
Well, mine's really short. So I was going to say, mine's really short. It's just the outcomes piece. It's just, don't be creating something in a silo that you think is needed. Looking at the outcomes and working in collaboration, create things that are actually needed and useful, and it will achieve the outcomes.
Outcomes. Piero?
Well, I think we have to, as I said from the starting point, that let's start not be scared of the unpredictable. Just taking care of the unpredictable, include it in the modeling when you're thinking and envisioning the future of our infrastructure, citizen community, because it could happen, and we need to look at this. I mean, it's a matter of is a willing to want to take into consideration when you then design. And sometimes maybe you have to spend money, invest money on funding that maybe could not be, let's say, positive in terms of using, but then if it happen, could save a lot of people, a lot of life. And I think that it's if you want to be a leader, if you want to be a resilience community, we need to invest also money for the unpredictable.
Okay, thanks so much both. And so that brings us to the close of day 1 of InfraChallenge. Thank you so much for participating, and I hope that that you can join the GR Hub and the G20 tomorrow for the final of InfraChallenge, where the winner will be decided live. Okay, is my video off? Okay. Yeah, not sure what's happening with in my video. Anyway, so the event tomorrow is free, so you can register at grhub.org and see, if you haven't seen them, the great description of all the innovation that part of that final. So thank you to all our expert speakers today. It was great discussion. Really appreciate all the insights, and I'm sure all the innovator on the line today also appreciate your ideas. So the GR Hub will be releasing some new work related to these topics over the next coming months, in particular on the circular economy, which I think Piero just mentioned, and the role of infrastructure on transformative infrastructure, transformative recovery of COVID. Sorry. So keep up to date with those activities on the website, and you can also register to a newsletter. You can see all that on grhub.org, and then follow us on LinkedIn and other social medias. And that concludes the evening, morning, depending on where you are. So thank you again, and I wish you a great day wherever you are. Thank you.